through all of this and wanted to kind of start with the disclaimer that I am learning this every day. And this was even a super helpful exercise for me to just write down, okay, how do I cope? What is helpful? How does the gospel play into this? So I'm learning as much as you and cannot wait to hear all of your thoughts. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Okay. Can everyone see that okay? Okay, perfect. All right. Yeah, so kind of like I was saying, I'm really just wanted to have a discussion today about how do we stay healthy emotionally and resilient while covering hard things. And I know some of you are journalists. I know one of you said you were a psychologist. Some of you are in other fields, but we all have to deal with difficult things in our jobs at different points. And especially for us reporters, um, it can be difficult when we're reporting on just, really hard subjects, but kind of from a distance. We're not really involved, and yet we're deeply involved and deeply invested in talking to people firsthand and researching. And so I think there is a tension there that I'd love to just talk about and discuss with you when we're done. And so I hope this is helpful in more than one way. But thanks again for listening. And I wanted to start with just a little, oh, wait, hang on. Oh, here we go. A little story. So I started working for World in January 22, so I'm still pretty fresh on the team. And it was in May 24th, when I was at my computer just doing some, typical research for a story. And my editor gave me a call and said, "Hey, Addie, did you see the news recently?" And I was like, "Oh dear, what's going on?" So I pull up, breaking headlines, and soon realized that 3 hours from me, I'm outside of Austin, Texas. There in Uvalde, Texas, there was a school shooting. 19 students were killed and 2 teachers. And I'm on the phone with my editor, hearing this for the first time. This had just happened. And she asked me, "Okay, Addie, like, you're our closest reporter, and I would love for you to go cover this as soon as you can." And at that point, I'd been working for a few months, and this was probably my first really big assignment, but also most definitely my hardest assignment as of yet. And thankfully, she had asked another reporter in Houston who was much more experienced than me to go with me. And so we were going to go together. We drove to Uvalde, met up there, and joined the crowd of reporters and TV cameras and well-wishers from all over the country that had poured into this tiny town to comfort or to cause chaos, one of the two. And we had a tight deadline with a goal of reporting on how is this community responding to this tragedy? How is the church getting involved? How can we approach this tragedy from a Christian perspective? And yeah, we both were a little nervous. This was, at least for me, my first time covering a traumatic situation like that. And I learned a lot about what does that look like to have compassion as a reporter when we're covering deep loss and pain, and what shouldn't that look like. And since then, I've covered some other topics, whether it be immigration, immigrants dying at the border, problems in prisons or trafficking. So there's been other heavy issues, but I just kind of wanted to start off that this was really the first time when I started thinking about this. And I think we're going to share the slides after, but I've linked all the stories on the pictures, so you can hit the picture and look at that. But this is my story that came out of this in the headline. So yeah, it kind of, for me, was the first time that I had to think about how should journalists show compassion? What does that look like as a reporter on the field, talking to people at home? And I think since then, as different situations have come up, I've really had to go back to this question again and again and be like, okay, what should that look like? What shouldn't that look like? And how have I done this well? And how haven't I? And what does the Bible have to say about this? And I think something that I've had to keep reminding myself again and again as I talk to sources and just really difficult situations, that as journalists, we are really professional listeners. And I think sometimes we underestimate the power and, well, the healing power of listening, and how listening is a way to show compassion and love people. So we get to sit down with people, often for hours at a time, depending on the situation. Sometimes it's 20 minutes, sometimes it's an hour, but we get to hear their stories, and we get to give them time to really just share who they are, their context to process with us. We get to ask good questions. We get to just offer a space of tell me your life story, really. And that is something that a lot of times people don't really have the opportunity to do. And I think, there's a temptation to kind of downplay that role and be like, well, I'm just here prodding into this person's life, asking them questions on, meeting a deadline, using this source kind of for a story. But I would encourage you all to look at that role as, yeah, really a God-given role in that moment. But on the flip side of that, to remember that journalists, we are not counselors. We are not there to offer platitudes, offer advice. I think it's tempting sometimes to really try to commiserate with someone and show your sympathy, but that can easily turn into us trying to comfort or make comments. And really, that role as a journalist, we are there to listen. And that in itself is enough. And so I think that's just something I've had to tell myself, okay, my role is not to comfort, my role is to listen. And I think that kind of plays into my next point of remembering that each source that we're speaking to bears the image of God. They have dignity, they are loved by their creator. And then at the same time, they are not our friends. And so really, we're here to give them dignity by listening to them, showing compassion in that way. But at the same time, we are still, thinking critically. We're asking sometimes difficult questions to people that we might not even want to ask difficult questions to, because we do feel a lot of sympathy for them, but remembering that we're here to tell the truth. But we can do that in this loving way, in this kind of giving our full attention and listening way. And something I was recently at a retreat for work, and something I was reminded of there is the reason that we approach people holistically in this way, prioritizing truth and yet seeing the person as a whole person and telling and listening to their whole story, is because John 14:6 tells us that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. So truth really is a person. It's the person of Jesus Christ. And because of that, we don't see truth as this abstract idea. We don't flatten people into ideas or stereotypes or sound bites, but we get to see them as whole people and tell their whole stories, while recognizing that there is truth. And we are there to find that and there to apply that, but also there to really make this person feel valued for who they are and for what their story is. And an example of this was a feature I did for the magazine earlier this year. I was writing about the abortion pill and the expansion of the pill, how pro-lifers and pregnancy centers are kind of fighting back and helping women to say no to this new method of abortion that's become sadly so popular. And I was able to interview a woman who had an abortion pill reversal procedure done. So she had taken the pill, but was able to save her child. And when I talked to her, she was, still very early on in her pregnancy. And it was incredible just to hear, her relief and to realize that, wow, her baby has the second chance at life. So I wrote the feature, and really everything had been done on it. My editors, were happy with it. And then I get a text from this woman, and she tells me, Addie, I just need to let you know that my baby has died. And yeah, I just wanted to make sure that you knew that. And she, was explaining kind of why she believed what the miscarriage had happened. And I talked to my editor after, and I was just really shaken up because I had spent, so much time with this woman. And it really was the first time when not the first time, but one of the few times when I was telling this woman's story as her story was happening, right? So I felt like I was super invested in this woman's life, kind of, because I'd talked to her for a few hours and had been following up with her with questions as I wrote the story. And I learned a super helpful lesson through the process, though, because my editor reminded me, Addie, like you, it is so wonderful that you have compassion for this woman, but at the same time, we still need to um, make sure we're telling the truth about this story. And we had to make sure that we followed up with the woman to confirm, was this another abortion? Was this a miscarriage? Because in the story, we needed to make sure we weren't propping this woman up as a heroine when she is a human being and makes choices just like the rest of us. And we couldn't just take everything at face value. There was some kind of weird things about the situation that had come up, and we were trying to get to the bottom of the story, what really had happened to her baby. And eventually figured out that it had been a miscarriage. And so I was, just praying for this woman when I could. But I think it was a really, just a really good experience and a reminder that, this woman is not the heroine, or whoever I'm writing about is not the hero of my story. They are people, they have stories, they, do good things. They also sin. And we are here to accurately, at least in this case, talk about, okay, what's going on with the abortion bill? How does this woman's story play into this, even when really difficult things happen? And it's tempting to be like, oh, wow, this woman has gone through so much, and I just want to paint her as perfect, basically, in the story. And so, so that's kind of an example for how do we interact with our sources, not as friends, but still with compassion and listening well. And so I wanted to make clear that we will all experience compassion fatigue and burnout at some point. I think as journalists, it's just going to happen. We have to acknowledge that we will get burned out. And so when we do, how do we cope with that? I mean, when in the middle of this, situation, this story that I was just telling you, there was times when I was crying. There was times when I was like, okay, I just feel really tired and really done right now. So when that happens, how can we deal with that? And so I'm going to start with some examples for maybe when we're out on the field reporting, kind of going back to my Uvalde example. When you can, don't go alone. Take a coworker with you. I think that is super valuable for, first of all, just creativity and bouncing ideas off one another, but then kind of secondly, praying with each other on the field, taking time to process with each other, asking for prayer from your community at home before you go and do a difficult assignment. I remember texting probably at least, 5 to 10 people before I left for Uvalde, being like, hey, please pray for me. Please pray for spiritual and mental health during this time, because it was difficult, and it was so helpful to know that there was people backing me up at home. I think another thing that I can struggle to do on the field is not letting my reporting material pile up. So after every day of reporting, taking that time before I unplug to write down notes, to go through it, to organize it, so that when I'm done, not, finished with the assignment and having to actually write, I don't have this mountain of material to deal with when it's already this kind of, huge, emotionally charged topic that I almost like am avoiding and don't want to spend a lot of time on, because it's just so mentally draining. So if I have this huge pile of material to dig into, it can make it even worse. And so really making sure while you're on the field, you're keeping yourself organized and not procrastinating. And then, of course, taking time to rest. I think even while I was in Uvalde, just making sure that kind of at the end of every day, there was a period of time before I went to sleep where I was able to, call someone, to watch something, read something, to get my mind kind of off where I was and what I was doing for a second. And that was and is just really helpful. Sometimes we forget just how refreshing even just like a half an hour of putting our mind on something else can be. So here's kind of an example of me on the field recently. So earlier this year, my coworker, Bonnie Pritchett, actually, and I were at the border, and we were working on a feature in a radio series about immigrants who die at the border and their bodies are often unidentified. So what happens to their bodies, and how are these rural Texas counties dealing with their bodies, giving dignity to these people by doing their best to identify them and tell their stories and reunite their remains with their family. And so while we were there, we actually were on a ride along with a sheriff's deputy, and he got a call from Border Patrol saying, "We found this body. Can you come pick it up? We need to take it to the funeral home." And so we actually were on scene when they found this woman. And so yeah, we definitely encountered a lot of heaviness and death and just tragedy during this story as well. And I think a lot of the things that I had learned in Uvalde were really helpful here, and having someone with me on the field, having people praying, yeah, and taking that time to just rest and process as I went along. And then for a lot of us, I know working, in different locations as reporters, some of us work remotely. And so I think this is something that I've had to learn. I think I realized, oh, of course, I'm going to have compassion fatigue on the field when I'm out reporting, but I do a lot of reporting from my home. I do a lot of Zoom calls, a lot of emailing, phone calls. And I realized that there were times when I would have a lot of compassion fatigue covering difficult things right from my kitchen table, and wasn't really dealing with it because I wasn't in a setting where I was like, oh, yeah, of course I should be experiencing this. No, I'm just at home, but I'm still processing a lot of heavy things. And so something that's been helpful and I've had to learn is a lot of times, and this applies too for even coming back from the field when you have so much to process, a lot of times people don't know how to help you and they don't know what to ask. So I remember coming back from Uvalde, I was dreading the question of how was it? Like, that to me was the most scary question because it was so broad, so vague. I had no idea how I would answer it. I was like, I don't know. I was just in this traumatized town for 3 days. There is, I mean, just pictures of these little children everywhere. And I was like, I don't even know how I'm going to engage with that at this point. And so I remember I was just so tired too, because I'd been driving. So I literally just laid down, took a 3-hour nap. I'm like, no one talked to me. And then later, right, I realized that I really did need to process. And so I was able to eventually, but I think what I learned from that, and what I've learned even just day-to-day reporting wise, is even teaching others how to ask you the right questions can be really helpful. So, my husband will often ask me, hey, how was your day? And sometimes my day was really difficult and there's a difficult story that I'm in the midst of, and it's a really hard topic and I'm getting all these conflicting, sources and voices, and it's overwhelming. And I'm just like, needing to process that. But I need him to ask me, hey, tell me about like this specific part of your story, or tell me about specifically how you're feeling about this part of your job. And I think helping him and others in my life ask me specific questions has been very helpful versus just the how are you doing. Yeah, so that's been definitely helpful. I think also having people check in with you in small ways many times over the course of maybe a few days when you're working on a difficult project versus one time at the end, okay, here's our debrief session. To me, that's very overwhelming. It's like, I have to tell you all of my thoughts right now. I can't even process them myself. So having people check in periodically, and just like, it doesn't even have to be long conversations, but just really allowing your brain and to kind of begin to say, oh, this is what's impacting me, and then being able to share that here and there with people. Yeah, and then I think the difference between coping versus numbing is something I've had to think through as well, in terms of what is, this kind of the third point as well, what is true rest and what is kind of just numbing our feelings and never processing through the hard things that we are reporting on or dealing with. And so not all rest is created equal, that is for sure. There's a very big difference from, immediately going from work to binge watching a TV show and never interacting with people, or taking that time to process with them or journal or pray. But there's also a time for, yeah, like, I'm going to just shut my brain off for a little bit and watch this show, but using that as a way to rest versus as a way to, I'm going to avoid this for as long as possible. And I think fourthly, when we are experiencing compassion fatigue, I think it can be a good time to check in and evaluate, okay, how are my work-life boundaries going at this time? Maybe part of my compassion fatigue is I'm thinking about this topic I'm writing on or this project I'm reporting on all of the time. And it's literally consuming every waking moment, every conversation I'm having with people. I think a conversation check is a good way to evaluate those boundaries. It's, is every time I'm talking to someone about my work and about what I'm doing. And obviously, we've talked about that those types of conversations are a way to process and are really helpful. But sometimes I just realize, oh, my mind is wholly consumed with this right now. And so, how can I kind of set that aside and pray through that and put my mind on something else? And maybe that's as simple as, okay, I'm really not working in working hours. But a lot of times, I think it can just be we're so obsessed with a project or whatever it is that we're just like, it's hard to kind of separate that from the rest of our lives. So that's just a good key indicator. Okay, I'm having this compassion fatigue. Let's look at work-life boundaries. And I know I'm going already a little long, so we're gonna speed through this. This is just an example of a story and kind of something I wanted to mention to you. I think we talked about how we all are going to feel burnout and compassion fatigue at some point, but there are going to be stories and topics that are more difficult than others for each of us. And that I think really depends on our own life experience. And so this was just an example of a story I did from my home about a trafficking situation in Ghana and some controversy there and with children involved. And I think anytime that children are being mistreated in any way, those types of issues and stories are really difficult for me. And so this was a story where I realized it kind of did consume my life for 3 days. And I kind of had to look back on that and realize, okay, this was, let's evaluate how I can approach a project like this in a healthy way. And thankfully, my husband was really helpful in terms of having those conversations, even when it was a lot of our conversations for a couple days, and even reminding me to take that time to rest and to pray and process in a healthy way versus continually kind of talking and ranting about this constantly. So this is just an example of from my home. This was a hard project and something that I had to work through. And I wanted to close by talking about just the fact that we as biblically objective journalists get to write and report from a redemptive worldview. And I think of all of these things, all of these different tools or ways to cope or talk with others, I think this has been the most helpful thing for me in dealing with compassion fatigue on the job and realizing that our worldview does not shy away from sin in the world, but at the same time, we get to look forward to restoration, that Jesus is restoring our world. He is coming again. He is making everything new, that we have this incredible hope because of that. And I remember being in Uvalde and, standing with all of these reporters and just the mad rush of media and thinking, wow, there is no way that I could do this assignment, a report on this story and this horrible tragedy if I did not have this worldview of redemption, if I didn't have this hope. And I think we underestimate the value of that a lot when most of these reporters, they don't have this worldview. They're reporting day to day on really hard issues without the hope that there will be justice, that Jesus is renewing the world. And I think that is huge. And that is really the only way that we're going to be able to work through that compassion fatigue and keep going. Because, if we don't have that hope, I just can't imagine how difficult that would be. And so I have a few verses here. I won't read them all just for time's sake, but John 16:33 really stood out to me as I was preparing for this. It says, I have said these things to you that you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And then Revelation says, and he who is seated on the throne, behold, I am making all things new. Just reading that, oh my goodness, I need to read that every day. It is such a huge part of just day to day realizing the value of our work and keeping going, because Yeah, there's just been a lot of times when I have wanted to quit because it is really difficult. And I think going back to that again and again of we get to be honest about what's broken in the world because we have that hope and that allows us to do that. All right, so I want to open it up for a discussion. I know I kind of threw a lot out there really fast, but I'd love to hear about a time when maybe you've experienced some kind of compassion fatigue, whether it's in reporting or in another aspect of your job, um, and how you've coped with that. If you're a reporter, like, are there particular issues that you find difficult? And then we can follow up with just how has having that redemptive worldview affected your work. But let's just start off with examples. Have you experienced compassion fatigue in any way? I'm gonna stop sharing this. Let's see. Oh, or maybe I should. Do you guys want the questions up there? Okay, let me share it again. Okay.
Or Addie, would it be easy to copy them and just put them in the group chat on the side? That way we can see each other's faces too.
That could work. Let me try that. Okay. I know I want to like actually have a conversation with you guys. Let's see. All right. There's our question. So yeah, you can take first one or any of them that stick out to you, but
I really appreciated what you had to say, Addie, and I think that's super helpful and relatable. My first big article I did was about trauma and foster care, and I just wasn't quite prepared for how much it was going to take a toll on me because I would sit in the basement and make all these phone calls, and it was like I would get off the phone or at the end of the day and just think, why do I feel like I got run over by a train? I don't know what's happening. And then it kind of connected the dots like, wow, I've kind of been on the phone with someone who lost their children, through, a crisis situation, had their children put in foster care for a couple hours or an hour and a half. And that does, we're not immune to that. So I think what you had to say was really helpful about how you create that distance and keep it in perspective that God's still in control. And even if you're struggling to see the redemptive end to a particular person's story, that like that's just a small piece of the whole picture.
I relate to that feeling a lot. I mentioned I understood compassion fatigue going out with my recorder, like on the field, but I was like, wait, why do I feel like this at my kitchen table a lot of times? So very relatable.
I've got a cold, so I'm losing my voice. So if my voice sounds scratchy, that's why. But before I started with World a couple weeks ago, I worked at a TV station here in Louisville, and back in April, I think it was, we had a mass shooting, and I remember driving on the interstate on my way to work and literally almost being run over by